Okay, you're good to go. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, Assalamualaikum and a very good day to everyone. Okay, I'm Munirah Maarof from Norizan Associates. I'm moderating today's session. So let's kick off the session now with a brief introduction of the event today. So we had about 181 pre-register for the webinar, and I can see now more and more slowly starting to join the session. So welcome everyone to the GRP Webinar Series on the topic of Keeping Singapore Ticking, the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act, hosted by Malaysian Productivity Corporation and co-organized by Pemuda and PSBN. So the GRP Webinar Series objective here is actually to provide a platform where we bring experts to share information and best practices regarding good regulatory practices, GRP. It covers various topics to help policymakers, regulators, businesses, academia, researchers, and interested parties to enhance knowledge on how to improve the quality of regulation without slowing economic growth, innovation, competitiveness, and job creation. So today's topic, like we mentioned earlier, about the Singapore's COVID Act, the main objective of this session is to provide an overview of the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act 2020, the key measurements and impact of the Act to businesses and individuals. With us today, allow me to introduce our speaker, Mr. Harikumar Pillay, and a bit of a background bio about Mr. Hari. So he is an associate principal in the Competition and Antitrust Practice Group at Baker McKenzi, Wong and Liew. His practice covers competition, law and regulation-related advisory work in Singapore and the ASEAN region. Up until September 2018, Hari was the director of the Enforcement Division at the Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore, CCCS, for close to 10 years, where he supervised the CCCS's intelligence units and IT forensics task force. So in addition to the supervision of case teams on various investigations, mergers and acquisition and notifications, he was also responsible for managing leniency applications made to the CCCS, overseeing the secret complainants and reward schemes, planning and executing dawn raids, and recording investigative statements of persons under investigations. So Hari led teams involved in defending appeals brought against the CCCS's decisions before the Competition Appeals Board. He regularly assists clients with matters relating to cartel investigations, mergers and acquisitions, joint venture agreements, abuse of dominantness investigations, competition compliance, and audits. He also advises competition authorities on enforcement strategies, competition policies, institutional frameworks, and work process reviews, and legislative amendments. Prior to joining Baker McKenzi, Wong and Liew, Hari had completed stints in both private practice and public service with OC, Osborne Clark Queen Street LLC, Drew and Napier LLC, and as a justice's law clerk with the Singapore Legal Service. So just a bit of some ground rules of the platform. During the webinar, participants are invited to send questions via the questions box. If you see on the right-hand screen of the webinar screen, on top of the chat box, there is there's a chat box there, but you send the question box, the questions through the question box. If you're entering by mobile, you would see at the bottom of your screen, there would be either a question mark symbol there, or there would be a word that says questions. So please send it to the question box and not the chat box. Please send any questions, or if you need clarifications on the presentation, we look forward to receiving them. And the speaker at the end of the presentation will address some of the questions received. If we don't have time to address all of them, we will select some of the questions to represent some of the queries raised. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and we will publish in the website of MPC within the next few days. So without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Harikumar Pillay to do his presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Munirah. Good morning, everyone. My name is Hari. Thank you again, Munirah, for the introduction. I will not spend any more time going through that. I hope all of you who are listening in are keeping safe and keeping well during these times. It's important that we all stay healthy, and I hope you are all well. As stated on the opening slide itself and in the blurb that was circulated, the topic that I will be speaking on today will really be on the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act 2020 and how it is keeping Singapore ticking. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted businesses and lives all around the world. So in an attempt to keep Singapore going, the Singapore government has implemented novel and extensive business continuity and public health measures through this COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act. And this is what I will be talking to you about. Next slide, please. So the topics that I will be covering today will really be, firstly, the introduction, which will be to give you a quick snapshot of what the Act is about. And then I will move on to the genesis of the Act. So I talk about how everything came about from the inception right until the time or the day on which the Act was passed. And then I go on to what are the key measures of the Act. Here I will talk about 6 key measures, and I will try to explain how they work in practice and what they cover. Thereafter, I go on to the impact of the Act, and this is really the short-term impact that we have seen as a consequence or result of the Temporary Measures Act. And then last but not least, some takeaways, some observations that we have seen taking place since the Act was brought into force. Next slide, please. So this is the introduction, and the intention of the introduction, as I mentioned, is to really give you a very quick takeaway, a snapshot of what the Act is about in a nutshell. If we could go on to the next slide. The COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act 2020 was purely Singapore's attempt to relieve the consequences that the COVID-19 pandemic was causing to not only people, but also to businesses alike and to economies, not just around the world, but also specifically in Singapore. And unusually, because of the urgency that was caused by the pandemic, this bill, one of the interesting points about it was that it was read, debated, and passed all on the same day. And some of these measures have been cited as new, unique, novel, and extensive, and they touch on both public health and business community. Of course, the other key point to note is that they are temporary measures, and these cover various areas. So, for example, control orders to reduce the spread. So this is the public health perspective. The inability to perform contractual obligations. So here's a business perspective. Relief for financially distressed individuals and businesses. Again, there's a business context here, but also for the individuals who are facing financial difficulties brought about by the pandemic. The conduct of meetings. So certain legislations say that physical meetings must take place. For example, in the Companies Act. So this act is puts in place some temporary measures that make exemptions on the conduct of meetings. Keeping the courts functioning, and some temporary measures in relation to that, and also the remission of property tax because of the effects felt by the pandemic. If I go on to the next slide, this will bring me on to the second topic that I was planning to touch on, and this is really the genesis of the Act, which I mentioned would be to give you a sense about how things were conceptualized, how things were put in place, how things moved to the end until it was passed. So if we could go on to the next slide. Here we talk about really, in order to understand the Act and the purpose, we need to first, have an appreciation of the situation and the setting in which all of these came about. So even before the first COVID-19 case reached Singapore, where we had the first infection, the Singapore government had already set up a multi-ministry task force to direct the government's response to COVID-19 if it were to hit Singapore. A lot of this thinking came about because of the experiences that Singapore went through during the SARS pandemic. So as soon as the Singapore government started seeing things take place in other countries and how the COVID-19 virus was beginning to spread, the multi-ministry task force was set up in order to combat any issues that would be brought about by the fact that the pandemic would then cause problems in Singapore from both a public health perspective and also for the economy and businesses. The multi-ministry task force, so their role, they coordinated a multi-pronged approach together with other ministries and government bodies to address economic, social, and health needs, as I mentioned, of both businesses and individuals. So some of the key things that came through these approaches was really the announcement of 3 particular budgets, the unity budget, resilience budget, and the solidarity budgets. And of course, the circuit breaker measures, which we are currently have in place, which is why we are all still on a work from home basis, unless you are an essential service. So all of these form the background of the Act. Still, onto the next slide, we will see a timeline of how things took place. So really, you have, on 22nd of January, where the multi-ministry task force was established. And if you see on the slide there, it states that the number of cases was 0. And then thereafter, you start seeing the unity budget was announced on the 18th of February, slightly a month later. And at that stage, we had already 81 cases. WHO declared the pandemic on the 11th of March. At this stage, we had 178 cases. And then the resilience budget was announced on the 26th of March. The conception of the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act was around the 30th of March 2020, and then at that stage we already had 879 cases. So this is where you see the timeline of how things were conceived, how things came into place, and then after the conception of the Act around the 30th of March, the circuit breaker was announced on the 7th of April, stating that it would go on till the 4th of May, but this has now been extended to the 1st of June. The solidarity budget was then announced on the 6th of April. Thereafter, the circuit breaker commenced on the next day, and then, as I mentioned, on the 21st of April, the circuit breaker was extended to 1st of June. At that stage, we had 9,125 cases. As of yesterday, there were close to about 17,000 cases. So this was essentially how the Act came about. So as I mentioned, the number of cases have rose steadily. In February 2020, the unity budget was announced, and this was served to provide payouts to all Singaporeans. Safe distancing measures were introduced on the 13th of March. So for example, all ticketed cultural, sports, and entertainment events, with 250 participants or more, had to be deferred or cancelled, and employers were also required to put in place measures to reduce close contact as far as possible. Due to the growing number of cases, the government also ramped up its safe distancing measures in March 2020. So as you will see from here, there was a progressive change in terms of the measures that were put in place. Then on the 26th of March, when the resilience budget was announced, this touched on increasing the payouts in the unity budget and provided more support to community groups and improved the flexibility on the government fees and loans. And within this setting itself, the government started, conceiving the idea for the Temporary Measures Act bill in late March, which all then came about on around the 30th of March. So despite best efforts, the safe distancing measures were not slowing down the spread of the virus fast enough. And as a result, the government announced a circuit breaker on the 3rd of April, which was due to start on the 7th of April. And it was supposed to last for roughly a month. Further, within around 9 days, the bill was passed as an act on the 7th of April as well. So all of these moved very fast, and the act served to help implement the circuit breaker measures, in addition to other measures, and also it tried to mitigate the consequences of implementing such circuit breaker measures and other COVID-19 related problems. For example, if only essential services were permitted from operating, then other businesses were going to face financial difficulties, and all of these had to be addressed through the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act. So as you can see, and I mentioned we have now extended the circuit breaker to 1st of June, and we will take a look at the way in which this was approached through the various budgets that were covered by the Act. So on to the next slide. Here I will touch about, and I'll discuss a little bit about the Unity budget and the Resilience budget. So the slide itself provides you with a description of what the Unity budget is and also what the Resilience budget is. And then on the top right-hand corner, you have the date on which it was announced and the number of cases at the time at which it was announced, to give you a sense as to where things stand or where things stood when the budget was announced. So the Unity budget itself is a one-off cash payment ranging from between $100 to $300 depending on the income. And then you have additional $100 cash payout for each parent with a child below 21 years old. It also gives a $100 grocery voucher. And then there's a $100 passion card top up for Singaporeans aged 50 years and above. And then a GST voucher. The Resilience budget, however, touches on help with daily expenses, and it strengthens the network of support and also provides greater flexibility on fees and loans. So for example, with daily expenses, it triples the one-off cash payment. It also gives enhanced workfare special payment of $3,000 for lower waged workers. There's a $100 passion card top up for Singaporeans above 50 years. And then for the strengthening of network support, $20 million worth of grants to self-help groups, $70 million worth of grants to community development councils, $25 million worth of NTUC Care Fund, and $4 million contribution to self-employed person training support scheme. And in addition to that, there was also up to $300 one-off relief to low to medium income union members. In terms of the flexibility on fees and loans, there's a one-year freeze on all government fees and charges. There's a one-year suspension of university and polytechnic student loan repayment interest charges. And then there's a 3-month suspension of late payment charges on HDB mortgage arrears outstandings. So across these 3 budgets, the Singapore government committed close to $60 billion, and that's 12% of Singapore's GDP. So $60 billion, 12% of Singapore's GDP. And this was spent on wide-ranging measures. It was, targeted towards job protection, immediate cash to Singaporeans, measures to help stabilize businesses, and I'll touch a little bit more about these on my later slides, and also included government-supported loans. The 3 budgets, as set out in my timeline, were adopted in a measured and incremental measure progressively, where the government announced the new budgets as and when they were deemed necessary due to the changing circumstances to which they felt Singapore needed to adapt itself to. Next slide would be the solidarity budget. And here with the solidarity budget, again, it's set up in the same way. On the top right-hand corner, you have a sense as to when it was announced and the number of cases you will see. And this is a trend that I have put into all my slides so you can get a sense as to how things progress and what changes were made on a given date at a time where we had certain number of cases. In terms of the solidarity budget itself, it stated that every adult Singaporean will receive an additional $300 cash payout. The payment of the first tranche of payouts announced in the Resilience budget, so the second budget, will be brought forward to April 2020. And then all other payments from the Resilience budget will be brought forward to June 2020. So those were the announcements that were finally made in terms of the budget. Next slide, please. Here, in terms of the genesis of the Act and what it was intended and thought to put in place, we come to the circuit breaker measures. So the circuit breaker measures that touch on two groups. One is the businesses, and really the second is on individuals. For businesses, the do's were to continue in-person business activities at business locations if they were classified as essential services. Otherwise, no. They had to maintain safe distancing measures at their business locations for essential services, and they had to operate online if the non-essential service can be performed from home. What they were not supposed to do was that they cannot continue in-person business activities at business locations if the business has been deemed non-essential service. In terms of individuals, they were told to stay at home and avoid leaving the home unnecessarily, keep a distance of at least 1 meter from others in public, except in lifts, vehicles, and public transport, and they were asked to wear a mask in public. What they were not supposed to do, they were not supposed to organize or attend social gatherings with friends and relatives not within the same household. They were not to leave home for work unless the job falls into the list of essential services. So for example, food, health, social services. They were not to attend classes in school, and all students were to engage in home-based learning. Again, this was on 7th of April, case number 1481 at the case count. Next slide, please. Here we talk about the multi-pronged approach of the Act itself. So it gives you a little bit of sense as to what it was targeted for. Against the backdrop of the health and economic situation, this multi-pronged approach, which was set up by the multi-ministry task force, so that all the sectors were accounted for and dealt with, and all the stakeholders within those sectors would be considered, and their interests and whatever they were facing, the problems they were facing, could be addressed effectively. The bill itself, described as Noah's Ark, was prepared in 9 days from conception to delivery, as I mentioned, and with contributions from various ministries and agencies. And this was really possible because it was fronted by the multi-ministry task force that was already, gathering views and had input from its various stakeholders. There was also input to the bill and the Act from leading private practice lawyers and the Attorney General's office. The bill was designed to provide relief and protection as a legal circuit breaker, and they targeted with targeted and temporary measures to offer relief for a certain period of time. So it was not something that was going to be a long-term measure. It gave much needed liquidity to commercial parties and businesses, and it was looking to redistribute monies between the parties to the affected contracts of businesses or people. The Act itself was passed by Parliament on 7th of April 2020, and with different parts of the Act coming into force on different dates. Next slide, please. So this brings me on to the third section, which really touches on the key measures of the Act. And here I have 6 key measures to go through. The first key measure, as you see on the slide, is the temporary control orders to restrict the spread of COVID-19. So here it is more in relation to the virus itself, and what are the temporary control orders that are going to be put in place to ensure that we can maintain and minimize the spread of the virus. So here really, pursuant to the Act, the control order regulations was then issued, and here is stipulated that every individual has to wear a mask when not in his or her ordinary place of residence. Every individual must not leave his or her ordinary place of residence unless he or she wishes to engage in an activity which falls within a prescribed list of activities. So, you have to be either an essential service worker, or, you're heading out to exercise. Those are that, or you're going out to buy food or groceries. Those fall within the list. Then also, if the individual leaves the ordinary place of residence, he or she must keep a safe distance of 1 meter from other individuals in public. Every individual must not meet another individual not living in the same place of residence for social purposes. Essential service providers such as healthcare services or F&B operators may continue to carry out businesses at permitted premises with prior permission, and non-essential service providers may only work from home. So these were put in place to limit the spread of the virus. And it was really one of the key impetuses behind the formulation and passing of the Act. Next slide. The second key measure I wanted to talk about is really the temporary relief for individuals and businesses that are unable to meet their contractual obligations due to COVID-19. So this key measure provides relief to specified contracts by putting a freeze on the right of parties to take certain legal action against the other party for failure to perform certain obligations required under those contracts for a 6-month period. And this is from 20th April to 19th of October. And in particular, this was targeted to the sectors or the business sectors that were most likely to be hardest hit by the pandemic itself. So, for example, construction, retail, transport, and of course, the tourism sector because of the travel restrictions. This new measure applies to contractual obligations that are to be performed on or after 1st February. So anything before that was not covered by this Act because it was not felt that the inability or the failure to perform certain contractual obligations were because of COVID. So it's only, to be sure that it's because of COVID, it's after 1st February 2020. The relief itself is not automatic. And it's only triggered when, one party serves a notification for the relief on all the counterparties and any surety, guarantor, issuer of a related performance bond. So it's there are certain conditions placed to it and certain stipulations to be clear what it covers. The Minister of Law also reassured foreign investors and other stakeholders in Singapore that the Act is not supposed, to be like a silver bullet or a Trojan horse to signal the likelihood for future or state interventions in the private affairs of contracting parties. And if you go on to the next slide, again, there's a little bit more about this particular key measure. So the notifications can be challenged, which involves a party applying for an assessor to determine whether the measure actually applies to the contract or not. And the Minister of Law has to appoint the panel of assessors. And in order to implement all of these within some cost-saving measures, these assessors, the application for an assessment by the assessors was supposed to be free of charge, even though they'll be done by panels of lawyers that are appointed specifically by the Minister of Law. And no party may be represented by an advocate or solicitor at proceedings before the assessor. So it has to be in person. This is again for the purposes of cost savings. And so, the businesses don't end up, having to face huge or high legal costs. And then also each party has to bear their own costs for proceedings before an assessor to determine whether a certain measure, whether this measure applies to the contract that they where there was a failure for them to perform a certain obligation. So that's really what the second key measure was due to address and was targeted at. Moving on to a little bit of a snapshot of what this particular key measure touches on and the types of contracts it's supposed to cover. There are 5 categories that you would see on the slide. The first is in relation to commercial and industrial property leases. So here it's really where tenants are unable to pay their rental, and landlords cannot, terminate the lease or evict the tenant on that basis. Construction and supply contracts for also, where contractors are unable to meet deadlines, there will be no liability for non-performance, and they may defer the contractual obligations. Event and tourism contracts, this is the third category. And here, deposits cannot be automatically forfeited. And there must be fair treatment of deposits taking into account expenses already incurred by the service provider. The fourth category is your secured loan facilities. And here, where you have small and medium enterprises, and they are unable to pay their secured loans, there should be no enforcement of security, and no court or insolvency proceedings are allowed. The last category, the fifth category, is your hire, purchase, and conditional sales agreements. So here, where the hirer or the buyer is unable to pay an installment, the goods for commercial purposes cannot be repossessed. That's number one. Number two, no court and insolvency proceedings are allowed. So all of these were aimed to target these categories of contracts. And in the event where there was an inability to pay and relief was needed, you needed to apply through the panel of assessors. So all of these processes were put in place in order to supplement the Act and give life to the Act, so that parties and businesses and individuals knew when they could actually trigger some of the reliefs from it and how to go about it. And these were brought about by regulations. And these regulations, are set out in the top right-hand corner in the green box, which gives you a sense as to what the key provisions of the Act are and what the regulations are that touch on these specific areas to give life to the provisions in the Act itself, in the event that you wish to look into this further. So that's the signposting that we have provided for you in the slides. The next key measure number 3, is to provide temporary relief for financially distressed individuals, firms, and businesses. Here, the Act itself says that they were going to relax the bankruptcy and insolvency regimes in Singapore during the 6-month period of 20th April to 19th October 2020. So for bankruptcy for individuals, the minimum threshold for bankruptcy proceedings was raised from $15,000 to $60,000, and the statutory period for demands from creditors increased from 21 days to 6 months. In terms of insolvency for businesses, this was raised from $10,000 to $100,000 in terms of the minimum threshold, and the statutory period to respond to demands from creditors increased from 21 days to 6 months. So this firstly gave businesses more time to settle their debt, same for individuals, and also put in place a system where you do not see more and more individuals and more businesses either being declared bankrupts or going insolvent. It allowed them more time to pay their creditors. It allowed them more time to get their businesses up and running after the COVID-19 pandemic was resolved, so that things could go back to normal and give them a little bit more breathing space. Next slide, please. Here we touch on the fourth measure. The fourth measure is really the temporary measures in place for the conduct of meetings. So as I mentioned at the earlier part of my presentation, there's certain legislation that requires meetings to take place in a physical setting. You have to turn up physically for certain meetings. For example, in variable capital companies, meetings for certain companies are mandated by the Companies Act. Business trusts, for example, debenture holders, all of that. So Section 27 of the Act provides the Minister of Law with powers to prescribe measures, temporary measures, for the conduct of meeting requiring physical attendance, to allow for flexibility for the meeting to be held, virtually, online, for example. And these flexibility was, the legislation or the regulations that put this in place was the alternative arrangements for meetings for companies, variable capital companies, business trusts, unit trusts, and debenture holders Order 2020. So this order provides for alternative arrangements for these classes of meetings, including general meetings of companies, to be held by electronic means, and contain detailed provisions relating to how you convene the meeting, how you hold the meeting, how you conduct the meeting itself in terms of, taking decisions, for example, or the deferral of such meetings until a later time where you're actually able to meet physically again. So all of these were provided for through this order, and that addressed the situation where you needed to have physical meeting. On the next slide, a little bit more of a description about this particular key measure for the conduct of meetings. And this order, sets up, as I mentioned, alternative arrangements for general meetings. And it says that a meeting of a company may be convened, held or conducted, whether wholly or partly by electronic means, how a quorum may be formed by 2 members of the company, and the company may require a member to appoint the chairman of the meeting as the member's proxy to vote at the meeting by depositing with the company an instrument of appointment by post. So all of these are taken care of through this order to ensure that businesses can continue to have their meeting even though they're required to be physical meeting, and because of the COVID-19 that's not possible to have alternative means for businesses to carry out their work. So that's the 4th measure of the Act. I'll move on now to the 5th measure, and this is really to keep the courts functioning. The relevant provision is Section 28 of the Act itself, and the Act provides for temporary measures for courts to carry out their proceedings using remote communication technology. So these measures would, it's stated that they will remain in force for any period that any control measure relating to the COVID-19 event is in force. So it's quite specific and quite long as well, because it covers to any measure relating, so long as any measure relating to the COVID-19 event is still in force, the courts have to continue to use remote communication technology. And any further period that the Chief Justice determines is necessary for the purposes of conducting court proceedings in a safe and efficient manner. So where court proceedings are conducted using remote communication technology, it is also stated that it becomes an offense if someone brings or uses an audio recorder, electronic device, or other instrument to take an audio or visual recording into any place where the judge, witness, or any person is participating in such proceedings. So it gives you a little bit of control in relation to how these remote court proceedings take place. So all of these have to be thought through in terms of what the repercussions are once you start holding court proceedings through remote communication technology, and what needs to be addressed and what needs to be accounted for in order to ensure that the court proceedings is carried out in a good and clean manner. Then moving on to the next slide, which is the final key measure that I wanted to talk about, and this is really the temporary measures for the remission of property tax. So the Act itself imposes a duty on property owners to pass on to their tenants the full amount of the property tax rebate that is attributable. So whatever property tax rebate landlords received or property owners received, they had to pass it on to their tenants. So the property owners are prohibited from imposing any conditions on the tenants when passing on the rebate. So they cannot say, I'm giving you the rebate and you have to extend your lease by another 1 year or 2 years. No conditions can be placed when they pass on the rebate. The property owners may pass on the property tax rebates to their tenant in cash or as a rental reduction. It's up to the property owners, so long as the rebate is passed on. The next is, the Act also requires the property owners to keep records showing, evidencing that the benefit has been passed to the tenant. And they have to keep these records for 3 years after the end of the period to which the property tax rebate applies to. And a failure to pass on the rebate or keep a proper record that the rebate was passed on is an offense, and the property owner can be liable for a fine not exceeding 5,000 Singapore dollars. And if the landlord does not pass on the benefit fully within the time period prescribed by the Minister of Law, the tenant has the ability to take action against the landlord for failing to do so by applying to a valuation review panel by the cutoff date of 31st December 2021, so end of next year. So this allows the tenants some room to ensure that they're able to receive the rebate from their owners, from the property owner or the landlord. So these are the 6 key measures of the Act. I will now very quickly touch on the impact of the Act. So the next slide, you will see what the impact of the Act is, and then thereafter I will talk about some of the key takeaways, and these are really my views and not those of the firm. So the impact of the Act itself is really, we've looked at it from the perspective of the short-term impact and then also the longer-term impact. In terms of the short-term impact, the COVID-19 circuit breaker that has been put in place because of the Act has been mixed. It has sparked debate over, whether it's efficient, whether it's, sensible, because many had doubts about the measures. They called for more stringent measures. For example, not allowing people to exercise in public. Members of public and businesses were also quite distressed by the impact of life on society itself. They were anxious about the impact on small businesses and local businesses in Singapore, whether they were able to ride out the time duration over which the circuit breaker was going to apply because of the loss of income. And there was concerns about the worsening of income inequality, given that those who are able to continue working from home tend to be mainly those people who are in managerial, administrative, or financial professionals, positions where they are financial professionals. Those who are on a daily income or daily contract are those who are not able to work from home and who would be most affected by measures such as these. So those were some of the comments that came into the debate over how effective these COVID measures are, the circuit breaker measures are, and what the impact is going to be. However, many people also praised the government's, businesses included, on the government's efforts in containing the coronavirus outbreak and providing support to both its people and its businesses in a timely measure. So, the government tried to mitigate the income inequality, which was addressed by some of the complaints by the circuit breaker measures by pouring billions of dollars, as I mentioned, $60 billion into income support. And people are confident that Singapore will be able to adapt to online work and homeschooling, given the government's long-standing support to building a digital workforce and transforming businesses digitally. So there's over the years, there's been a lot of emphasis on digital transformation and getting people to go online. So all of these now have helped during the circuit breaker period and helped the government implement the circuit breaker conditions more readily and more effectively. On to the next slide. In terms of the longer term impact, we're still really in the eye of the storm. We're still in the very middle of it, and we will only know the longer term impact much later on. But what is key is really that for these types of policy making and legislative introduction exercises, there are a number of valuable lessons that both ministries and regulators can take away through the post-implementation reviews. And really, with the benefit of hindsight, we'll become better at designing and implementing these regulations for future events such as this. So Singapore learned a lot from the SARS pandemic outbreak and was prepared for it right from the setting up of the multi-ministry task force. Another example is South Korea. They were able to quickly implement a contact tracing system with their Infectious Disease Control and Prevention Act. And this was passed in response to the MERS outbreak in 2015. So all of these prepare governments to deal with situations that will come up in the future. In order to mitigate such unpredictability, regulators, have to consider taking incremental and progressive measured steps in response to changing circumstances. So you have to be nimble, you have to be adaptable, and you have to be ready to make changes as and when the situation starts to go ahead of you in order to prevent it from getting ahead too far. And this is why also for each of the slides that I took you through, in the green box on the top right-hand corner, we signposted to give you a sense as to what was done on a certain date as the case numbers started to rise, to give you a sense as to, you know, how sometimes you really have to play catch up and sometimes you are ahead of the curve, and that's all well and good. So given that all of these measures are still temporary with the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act, it is unclear how businesses and the public health measures will evolve post-pandemic. It is still something that we will see and we will learn in time to come. But for now, it is addressing the issues and keeping businesses, keeping individuals going. Next, I will go on to the last section before we go on to question and answer. So this is really the takeaways and what really are our key observations from this whole COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act and the COVID-19 pandemic itself. There are 4 points that I would like to make. The first is really a whole of government approach. So here the main takeaway is that from in order to legislate and pass an act like this, the coordination across various regulators is quite key. It's essential, given that, you know, it's a multidisciplinary approach, which will be necessary to address the issues brought about by a crisis of this scale in a targeted and dynamic manner. They touch on issues that various ministries have oversight on. They touch on issues that affect stakeholders who respond to instructions or are licensed or affected by regulations and laws governed by various ministries, which is why it's a multidisciplinary approach and which is why a whole of government effort is required. It is also, you know, it will help you be able to deal with new and fast-moving issues such as digital industry revolution, where, you know, a multidisciplinary approach is needed in order to deal with these unique issues and novel issues that are created by the digital economy. The second takeaway or observation is that you have to take an incremental approach, where the circumstances are so dynamic and also, you know, so unpredictable, because it's not only a situation that you're dealing with within your own country. There are factors that are taking place across the entire globe that affect what happens in your own country. So in order to be dynamic and you know, because of the unpredictable situation, you have to be able to move fast, and it may be prudent then to take a measured and incremental approach when approaching these new measures in order to meet the changing circumstances. This can be illustrated by the incremental approach taken in relation to the 3 types of budgets, for example, or how things had to be moved in terms of, you know, travel restrictions because of the impact faced by, or the impact caused by the virus in other countries. Next slide, the last 2 observations. Third is really understanding your businesses. It is essential to understand the businesses that the ministries and the government agencies are looking to regulate, to understand what their interests are, what their concerns are, in order for you to be able to address the impact of the crisis on their operations and know how to best support them during this period. For example, the relief provided to individuals and businesses, you know, unable to meet contractual obligations is targeted at contracts relating to business sectors that, you know, were anticipated to be hit the hardest by the pandemic. And that's the key focus of it, to ensure that these sectors continue to remain you know, viable even after the pandemic situation. Because if they fall, and once we come out of the pandemic situation, these sectors would be almost dead or close to dead and will need injection of a lot more in order to get them up and going again, which is why it's essential right now to make sure that they remain viable, and all of these need to be done in a way that is dynamic. It allows you to move fast and make them more adaptable during this time, which is also the other observations we made in relation to digital transformation and why it is so important. The last observation is really subsidized transformations. And here, the crisis always presents an opportunity as well. And here is an opportunity for businesses to transform themselves during the downtime. so as to ensure, that their wings are primed to catch the next wave when the economy starts to recover. So here, for example, enabling businesses to start moving onto an online approach. Many restaurants, because of the circuit breaker measures, and since they were not essential services, they were only allowed to serve food for takeaway or for delivery. And many of them started to move online, set up, ordering platforms on their own websites, or they started partnering with online food ordering and delivery providers in order to get their food to customers. And you've also started seeing businesses innovate on the types of menus that they provide, innovate on the type of in the way in which they deliver to customers, from just a regional delivery to island-wide delivery. So all of these then allows them, when the COVID breaker or when the circuit breaker for COVID-19 is released, to be able to get back up and running as soon as possible. So, for example, one of the stat boards in Singapore, the Enterprise Singapore, anticipated demand for food delivery to increase during the circuit breaker period and launched the food delivery booster package to assist F&B businesses to transition from offline to online sales. I apologize. Yeah. So these are some of the subsidized transformations that we have observed taking place in the market, and it's probably the things that would keep these businesses going. And hopefully, when the time comes where the circuit breaker measures are lifted and COVID-19 pandemic is under control, or we are free from it, we will be able to get back to some form of normality that we were used to. It will of course take time, but at least they will be at some stage near normal and ready to carry on with business as usual. So with that, I'll stop. I'm sorry it went on for a bit longer, but there was a fair bit that I wanted to cover to give you a sense as to what the issues were and what our observations are. Happy to take questions now for the last 10 minutes or so.
Splendid. Thank you, Hari. Okay, there's some questions that we got. One of the first questions, I just quite hurry. I'll try and prioritize the questions by the participants that we have here. One of the questions by Jamalia Daud, she asked whether the Act actually addresses limitation period issues by suspending a certain period of time from its computation. So I realized that there's a section 5 subsection 7 in the Act that sort of addresses a limitation period. So would you want to explain further on that, Hari?
Yeah, very quickly. Some of these, as I mentioned earlier, they cover certain periods of time only. As the name itself suggests, it's the Temporary Measures Act. And then it goes on to state that, it covers, for example, for these contracts, it's a 6-month period from the 20th of April to the 19th of October. There is that. And then there's also, the property tax rebate issues. For that, the claims can only be made by the tenants by 31st of December 2021. So there are those dates that are put in place there in terms of what needs to be done when claims are triggered, during which period, and how they need to be carried out. So those are the timelines that are set out in the Act, very roughly.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is, I hope that's clear to Puan Jamalia. For any further reference, the Act does detail different matters regarding limitation periods on other areas. Okay, the question by okay, I might have problem pronouncing here, Sin Ryu Leong. Apologies if I mispronounced it. Does Singapore government allow or have any NGOs contributing to the ground during this pandemic, and if there is any regulations around that?
I am aware that there are NGOs assisting the government with various work in relation to containing the pandemic. I'm also aware that there are NGOs that the Ministry of Law is engaging with to assist with assessing various issues or legal issues that have come about as part of the various panels that work on, assessing whether it's a contractual claim that really has been caused pursuant to the COVID pandemic. As to whether there are specific regulations that deal with this, I will need to quickly check on that. But I understand that, for example, where we are dealing with the issue in relation to key measure, let me pull that out for you. In terms of contractual obligations, where you have assessors being put in place and all of that, you have the COVID-19 temporary measures, temporary relief for inability to perform contracts regulations. So that deals with, the use of the assessor and how they deal with assessing whether a certain failure to perform a contractual obligation was pursuant to the COVID pandemic, and then thereafter what needs to be done. And for example, the implementing of cost-saving measures. So the application for assessment is free of charge. The Minister of Law is the one that appoints the panel of assessors. So all of these, and this panel of assessors come from law firms, which are essentially non-government organizations, and they do it, almost, for want of a better word, pro bono, as it's free of charge. And because the parties themselves will not be represented, it's this panel of assessors that will assess whether the claim is something that is caused by the pandemic situation, and then what needs to be done.
So basically, the panel of assessors are a group of selected lawyers to help with any contractual issues. So it's not from professions of different backgrounds?
That's right.
Okay. So I'm guessing if there is any sort of reimbursement or rewards for assisting, it would be between the ministry and the relevant panel.
It's actually free of charge. It's free of charge. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I hope that answers that question so far, Sin Wu Long. And the third question here is by Carmen K. She asks, does the Act define what constitutes inability to pay rental? And does it does the property tax rebate from the landlord to tenant applies to commercial property only, or does this apply to any sort of rental regardless of whether the tenant is able to pay the rental or not? This is a further explanation on the property tax earlier.
Okay, this is something I will probably need to
go
check
on, Hari.
This is something I'll probably need to check on. My understanding is that it touches on commercial property. I am not sure if this covers, private rental leasing. I'm not certain of that.
Okay. All right.
Let
Carmen,
me see if I can
perhaps
check. Let me see if I can check and get back to you during the course of this Q&A.
Okay. Okay. So far, thank you for the questions that we've got. I'd just like to highlight to the attendees here, if you have any more questions, we'll try and take it up. I'm not sure whether we will be extending perhaps by a few minutes, but if you want a copy of the handouts, in case anyone asks or does not realize, in your screen there would be a handout button, and you can actually download the slides that was shared by Hari earlier. Okay, and again, if there is any point that you missed during this presentation, you can always go back to the record that will be uploaded on MPC's website, among others. And this webinar is also live fed to Pemudah Malaysia's FB Facebook account. So if you want to go back at any point in time, you can feel free to go there. Okay, is that all right, Hari, or should I move on to one of the last questions that we got from the participants?
You can move on to the last question.
Okay. Here, this is from David Jones. So he asks, I'm not a lawyer, however, does the COVID Temporary Measures Act override any force majeure or frustration clause in place where any contractual obligation is not met? Further to that question, he asks, are all contractors and their subcontractors covered by the Act when they don't meet the time-defined obligation? So I'm guessing this would be in reference to not a limitation period, but maybe the time-based, the contracts which are time-based. And also whether does the Act protect companies when supplying products and services overseas? So it's a three-pronged question. First, whether this Act covers or overrides any force majeure or frustration clauses. Secondly, in relation to time-defined obligations, does it also mention on that? And lastly, whether it protects companies when supplying products and services overseas.
Okay, so in terms of whether it overrides or not, typically if the contract specifies the force majeure is wide enough to cover situations such as these, this will typically be relied upon for the purposes of frustration. It is in situations where you wish to continue relying on the contract, and it touches on aspects that came into being on the 1st of February 2020, after the 1st of February 2020, and for the 6-month duration up to 20th of October 2020 is when these issues come about. And it will really be those instances in terms of the timeline for the trigger. Otherwise, the Temporary Measures Act itself will provide that because of these situations through a failure to perform, and there's not an ability or there's no possibility to rely on the force majeure clauses or the frustration clauses because they're not drafted wide enough to cover an issue or situation such as this. It's difficult to identify this as, for example, an act of God, and therefore your force majeure clauses may not be broad enough. This is where the Temporary Measures Act comes into place, and it's essentially the thinking behind the reason why we have such this particular key measure for the Temporary Measures Act. In terms of whether this contractual obligation is in relation to external parties in other countries, this I am not clear about. I'll have to look at the explanatory notes in relation to this. So that's the third part of the question that I'm not certain about. In relation to the earlier question on the leases or licenses, so the explanatory notes itself is silent on it. It does, but I've just checked. My team has also been checking, and it relates to leases of office premises, retail shops, industrial and warehouse spaces, but excludes residential property.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a very business focused kind of provision.
Okay. So Carmen, that is your response. So it does basically cover commercial properties. What did we also address the question regarding time-defined obligations earlier, or you needed to get back on this? Was it Hari?
So I've addressed the first two parts of the question.
Okay.
The last part in relation to foreign contracts, I will need to get back to you. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Okay, I wanted to ask, like, on our part, right? Trying to learn from Singapore as much as we can. One of the notifications or statements that we got today from the government is that if there is any consideration of Malaysian legislation for COVID, they said they might only be able to look at it in July. Yeah, and it's amazing that Singapore has managed to set up the multi-ministry task force earlier this year before there was even a positive case in Singapore, and from that on, having the circuit breaker implemented, Singapore went on to actually discuss and pass the act within 9 days. One of the main factors here, what I realized, is having it possible to have such a very fast time or expedited passing of the acts and also drafting of the legislation is because you have the multi-ministry task force set up very much earlier, right? Is there a way on how it was made possible as well that this task force and the government took the relevant input on the feedbacks on what areas that needs to be prioritized for Singapore? How did they do that? And how did they take up the comments and try and prioritize the areas based on the feedbacks from all the stakeholders involved?
Okay, so I think if this question goes towards public consultation and stakeholder engagement, yes, because the process moved very, very fast. It's not possible to hold an actual public consultation or stakeholder engagement since things needed to move fast, and there was an imperative here that given how quickly the virus itself was spreading, there was a need to act fast. And consultations or stakeholder engagements at that stage would have delayed the process. However, as I mentioned, there was the multi-ministry task force, and the multi-ministry task force is represented by, as the name suggests, various ministries and government agencies. And this is really the whole of government approach that I emphasized was quite key, because each ministry and the government bodies or the government agencies within those ministries oversee various sectors, and that will essentially cover the breadth of your economy. And through that engagement that probably took place from the time at which the multi-ministry task force was formed, they were already, getting the sentiments of the stakeholders whom they've got a mandate over. They were already probably getting the feedback of what was affecting the various stakeholders within their purview, and all of that got fed back to the multi-ministry task force that then combines this whole of government approach to have a sense as to what is affecting these businesses, what is affecting the individuals, what is affecting the health sector, and all of this then is put together when formulated by the multi-ministry task force, working with the government itself and the Attorney General in terms of drafting the act, deciding what it needs to address, what needs to be dealt with. So all of that is how it comes together.
Okay.
So the engagement and the consultation was done more as an organic kind of way in terms of when the task force was set up early on, and not as a formal public consultation because there wasn't time for it.
Okay. So we also realized that in the Singapore Acts, there are 3 different ministers that have been actually included towards monitoring the implementation of the Act in a way, where they've actually mentioned that the ministry responsible for law, finance and health has actually been clearly defined here. So one of the queries that I would have in mind as well, and also you have the background of being one of the director of enforcement of the CCCS, protecting competition and consumers in a way. How do you see that when one addresses what to be reflected in the Act and also the enforcement of the measures, the temporary relief measures that that is contained in the Act? How would for example, how would the assessors look at treating the positions fairly between the parties involved, and also balancing all the interests at stake? How would you sort of what opinions or views do you have on their methods on going about this and ensuring a fair and just a fair result or a fair decision at the end of the assessment or the assessment of the issues that might arise? Yeah.
So firstly, some of this may be a little bit quite far down the road to actually have a tab on. As for the specific ministries that deal with that have been identified, they have been identified to deal with specific issues. So, for example, the Ministry of Law and the Ministry of Law will appoint the assessors, and this is really for the purposes of assessing, whether a certain contractual obligation and the failure to be able to perform that obligation was caused or brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. And here, it's quite in terms of the discipline, the area of discipline, the assessors are made up of lawyers from law firms. So they have the expertise in that area and they deal with it. Of course, there are other aspects in the Temporary Measures Act that is not covered, as you mentioned, on competition, where consumers and businesses, that relationship, how that is dealt with. Of course, it's not in the Temporary Measures Act, but that's also because these other acts, for example, the Competition Act and the Consumer Protection Unfair Practices Act that deals with consumer protection, all of these are already drafted in a way that will allow the respective authorities to deal with the conduct as and when they come up under existing legislation without the need of having a Temporary Measures Act or a key measure within the Act to deal with such a situation. So the Temporary Measures Act really is very specific. It deals with certain specific issues and certain areas itself. Other areas like competition within the businesses and consumer and managing the businesses and consumer interests, that is dealt with by the Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore. And as I said, their regime and framework is set up in a way that will already allow them to do this regardless of the fact that there's nothing in the Temporary Measures Act that allows them to do so. And with the Temporary Measures Act, as I said, it's key ministries that oversee certain areas, and of course, with the Ministry of Law, it's quite clear. With the Ministry of Health, is managing public health situations and dealing with that aspect of it, and addressing issues that come up through there. So it is quite specific to the areas that they have to deal with and focus on.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there's another question here by Benjamin Yeo. It's similar to the earlier question that was raised by David Jones. He asked here, would the Act supersede the contractual provisions in the contract, for example, force majeure and suspension clauses? I think you've addressed that, or would you just like to lightly touch on this again,
Could you
Hari?
repeat that again, please?
He asked, would the Act supersede the contractual provisions in the contracts, for example, like force majeure and suspension clauses?
Oh, so like I mentioned, it depends on what the clauses cover. This Act itself is to deal with situations where it is not provided for in the contract, and it's a circumstance that has come up through or caused by COVID-19, and therefore you rely on the provisions in the Act to address it. Of course, if the Act itself, or rather the contract itself, covers this, then parties will be able to rely on this.
Okay.
On the contractual clause, yes. All
right. Thank you. Moving on. Okay. We realize that the Act actually has it's more framed towards certain sectors, for example, tourism and events, supply and collateralized loan agreements. So there's a schedule where the Act defines the areas or the contracts that are relevant to be assessed in a way. And one of the issues that, for example, that we see for Malaysia, unemployment. The Ministry of Finance has already reported as of date or 2 days ago that the unemployment rate now in Malaysia has reached like 3.6. So looking at the Singapore Act, is there a reason why, for example, employment matters or contracts weren't addressed specifically in this Act, or is it addressed in a different manner?
This is addressed in the budget.
Okay. So this is towards like financial incentives that was given?
Yes, yes. There's a wage supplement of up to $4,600, and this is addressed in the budget.
Okay, so in a way,
It's
there is
stabilization. It's a
no.
stabilization and support package actually. So yes, it's covered in the budget. It's dealt with.
Okay, okay. And that would continue for a certain period of time. I think looking at the amount that Singapore has given when it comes to wage subsidies, the financial incentives is quite a substantial amount compared to Malaysia, which the government has announced would be for a period of broken down between April and May. So I think there are businesses in Malaysia, like I've shared with you earlier, some sectors like hotels have already closed down, and there are companies, like, despite the availability of this wage subsidy, it just seems to not be enough because they have already incurred some losses, and there are a lot of unemployment issues now, and it continues to be one of the concerns. And I guess that's one of the reasons that the MCO is lifted earlier today, or conditional movement control order was implemented today. Are there, in your views, are there other areas that would have been possible, or would have been key for it to be included or reflected in the Singapore Acts, apart from the ones mentioned in the schedule as a scheduled contract?
So this, like I mentioned, to deal with, to address the issues of unemployment, it's dealt for in the budget. So I'll touch a little bit about that. And the wage support is really for the months of April and May 2020, and it will be topped up to 75% for all sectors to support firms during the circuit breaker period, or at least until the end of May 2020, which is when the circuit breaker ends on 1st of June. I understand also that there's a lot of thinking that is going on in relation to the ways in which to keep the tourism industry going. For example, by using some of the hotels to house stay-home notice returnees, redeploying, redeploying individuals who have been working in certain sectors that have been, for example, grounded or not able to carry out work to other sectors to assist, with the transport sector or the hospital sector, for example. So all of these are some of the debates that are ongoing right now to see whether it is possible to redeploy individuals so as to address, the income shortage and issues such as those.
Okay, thank you. So we are now at 11:17. So I think we might be ending soon. Okay. If there is any other question, or there is any other comments that they might want to make from the participants today, would they be able to be in touch with you, Hari, or
yes, definitely.
Would you be able to assist?
Please feel free to get in touch with me. Contact details are, of course, on the materials that have been provided, or you can also get in touch with the organizers, and I'll be happy to deal with questions and take questions. It's not a problem at all.
Okay. All right then. Thank you everyone for the questions today. I think I don't want to hold Hari for much longer, and I think everyone has sort of have their schedules on track, and it's already way past 11. I'd just like to share with you, I think the organizers have some announcements that they'd like to make. So this coming Friday, there are 2 events upcoming. One is a virtual advisory clinic on regulatory impact assessment. So this is RIA in a way. So if any one of you is new to RIA, regulatory impact assessment is one of the a practice by OECD that has been implemented by Malaysia in a way, even though it's not yet compulsory for government or any non-governmental organizations to conduct RIA exercises. This is one of the methods of towards good regulatory practices. So if you would want to learn more about what RIA is, please join our virtual advisory clinic, where they will assist some businesses. So this is by appointment based. You can register by company, so you can learn more about some compliance issues by if you're entering a new market, or you would like to convert into a new area of a new industry, or you would like to expand the current services or trade that you're in. And the one after that, they also have a GRP webinar series on Friday afternoon at 3 to 4 o'clock, Understanding Public Consultation in Malaysia by Dr. Izhar and also Vimala. So please do support MPC in the other programs that are coming. I think they will also share a schedule of their GRP webinar series and other webinar series that they're doing. I think MPC is doing quite a number of webinar series, and one of the new ones here is Virtual Advisory Clinic. So notwithstanding there is this CMCO, I think most of the sectors, including myself, will still be working from home as long as we are not required in a way to go back to the office. So for those who have any feedback for today, please feel free to, or please, we encourage you to give feedback by scanning on this barcode, or as well, I think Nancy has shared a link in the chat box. There's a Google form there for your feedback. So we'd really much appreciate your feedback so we can improve any future sessions from that. Thank you everyone for today. Thank you, Hari, he's gone. And thank you.
Thank you, I'm still here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Hari. It's been a pleasure, and we learned so much from you. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today, continuing to support us. Thank you to MPC, Pemuda, and PSBN for organizing this talk and this session. Thank you, and good day, and take care.
Take care. Thank you, Munirah. Thanks all for
Hari.
listening
Good
in.
day.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. As I already stopped the recording, so
Okay.
everything should be it runs very, very smooth. Thank you, Hari, Munirah. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great job. Yeah.
Thank
Bye.
you, Hari.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Good day. Bye. Bye, Nancy.
Bye.
Good day.
Good job.
Take care.
Good job, everyone.
Thank you, Nassim.
Bye.
Yeah.
Good day. Bye.
Good day. Bye.